So, hi everybody. Good morning. Sharon, Paul, and Chantel are worried about what I'm going to be doing. But they don't have to worry. They don't have to worry. You know what? Sometimes sitting on a chair for 3 days is hard. And I don't like it. And I'm sure Chantel and Sharon Paul don't like it either. Eh? No. So let's get up. And you're going to follow, we're going to do a little bit of a round dance, but maybe, are you going to sing or? Whoa! So we're going to do a little bit, maybe it's not a round dance song, but it's okay. We're too scared.
It's actually a round dance song.
Oh, okay.
You've been corrected. By the way, my name is Peter Lagos, and I also go by Winnie. You can call me She. Thank you.
That's my brother.
Sister.
I'm older.
And I'm younger.
So we're going to do that. So you're going to follow these three here and just follow and try to dance the way you want. Okay, are you ready? So follow Charlotte, Marjorie, and Alex.
way ya, way ya, way ya, hoo, way ya, way ya, way ya, hoo, lip, lip, la, 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 way ya, way ya, way ya, hoo, way ya, way ya, way ya, hoo, lip, lip, la, lip, lip, la, lip, lip, la, lip, lip, la. Join hands, we can finish the song. Way ya, way ya, way ya, hoo, way ya, way ya, way ya, hoo, lip, lip, la, lip, lip, la, lip, lip, la, lip, lip, la, way ya, way ya, way ya, hoo, way ya, way ya, way ya, hoo, lip, lip, la, lip, lip, la, lip, lip, la, lip, lip, la, way ya, way ya. Make a circle, make a complete circle. Way ya, way ya, way ya, hoo. Way ya, way ya, way ya, hoo. Lip, lip, la, lip, lip, la, lip, lip, la, lip, lip, la. Okay, now we're going into a conclusion. Sorry, I didn't see the circle wasn't that the greatest circle. Thank you very much. This is a good time. Yay! Right on. Lip, lip, la, yay!
Okay, take your seats. Come and join us.
I just want to share a couple of words.
Yeah. You do it after me and I'll... So if you didn't have enough dancing last night, I wanted to make sure that you participated in this dance this morning. So we woke up ourselves, woke up the spirits in the four directions. And I know that Pitana could ask for a circle, but our circle was a little crooked. And I think that's the way we are. So thank you.
Tansei bonjour. Hainista nipa wis kapskau ki hu square equa mikasumis the temen pimpatat. I want to wish everybody here a good morning and take the time to thank the Creator and the old ones for allowing us to be here on this land that we sit. When my cousin Barbara mentioned this to me this morning, it was like, oh my God, we're from the same heart. Because yesterday as I sat here and my heart was heavy with some of the stories that were being shared, and I thought, wouldn't it be beautiful if all the people in the room could join hands and hold hands in a circle to show our unity? And we've done that this morning. And yes, our circle was a little, but that's okay. That's who we are, you know. I mentioned to the people at my table this morning, somebody said, oh, you look so butch this morning. And I said, well, yeah, this is Charlotte. People that have known me know this is me. This is, you know, yesterday I struggled with, how do I dress elderish? You know? What is people's concept of elderish? And in my heart, I know that I'm still, you know, that little girl that never got a chance to play when she was 7 or 8 years old. I'm still that little girl that wants those Barbie dolls. I'm still that little girl that is looking for acceptance. I'm still that little girl that wants the love that nobody could give. But as I go by each day, I'm being reassured by all of you, by the people I work with, that I am loved, I am accepted. So for me, elderish is, you know, it's not a vision that we have of older people. For me, elderish is being a wisdom keeper, sharing the knowledge that has been passed on to me throughout my years from different elders, from different children, from different people. I shared the other night that it was children that gave me my courage to be who I am, to walk with honor, with pride, and with my head up as a woman. When that little boy asked me, he said, "Are you a man or a woman?" And I said, "Honey, I may be manly on the outside, but inside I'm all women." In 2 weeks, I'm going to complete that journey. I'm flying to Montreal and I'm going for my surgery. Something I've waited for all my life. And, you know, people ask me if I'm scared. Yeah, you know, anything could happen. But I trust Creator, because Creator has looked after me, looked after all of us. And Creator is here with us today as we sit and we dialogue with one another and we share our stories. And tomorrow the same thing again. And at the end of this conference, know that you have a bigger family. There's a young person here from the East Coast. Say welcome. Bonjour. We are all related. No matter what skin color, no matter what gender, no matter what race we come from, we are all related. We all bleed red. And I think we all put on our pants the same way, one leg at a time. I know I don't jump out of bed into both legs at once. So from this conference, take that you have a bigger family. And as time goes, that family's going to grow. And be kind to one another. Love one another. Accept one another. That's my gift to you. Ekose. Hi, hi.
I just thank Barbara for making fun of Chantal and I. Welcome, everyone. Everyone looks beautiful, bright-eyed, nice and rested. Got a little energy this morning from a round dance. Perfect. Excellent. So we are going to start. I'm a little confused now, but we are going to start with Reese. Reese is going to give some opening remarks about our plenary theme, which is education today, and then we will go into the plenary discussions. For those of you who are sort of new to coming into the space, I just want to say that we do have a wellness elders room up on 2M70 across the hall. So if things here are getting a little heavy, I know there was quite a few people in the room yesterday, and so if the conversations are getting heavy or you need a quiet space or you need to smudge, the elders are in there up in 2M70. If you do not know where that is, Chris, who is walking in right now, Chris wave, Chris will help you up there, or any one of us will help you up there. Across the hall from that is the Nine Circles Community Health, and they have a fun little table that they might even give you some prizes if you answer the questions correctly. I did not. Shows you what I know. But it's good to go and visit that as well. So just those couple reminders. Again, so how many of you went to Drop the Mic last night? Hands up. Oh, look. Uzoma just kind of went like this. Uzoma, you were there. Come on. Was it lit? It was. It was excellent. I was there. It was fantastic. So on your name tags for tonight's event, you do need the name tag. This will get you in for free at the WAG. Another thing I wanted to just point out, which was pointed out to the steering committee, is on our name tags, we thought we were, something just happened. So preferred pronoun, it should just say pronoun. So just to recognize and acknowledge that that was brought up to us, and we do recognize that. So with that, I'm going to ask Dr. Malone, Elder Reese. Should I call you Elder Reese? Okay, sorry. To give a few words. Sorry, I just made you really old.
Elderish is just fine. Thank you for the term. All right. Firstly, I certainly want to acknowledge my settlership and my privilege for being here today. I also want to bring greetings as well. We have a term in my country, and we say the term mabuhay. And mabuhay means welcome. It also is a term of adulation, and it literally means, in our language, long live. And so when we say mabuhay, we say long live. Long live for your authenticity. Long live for your integrity. Long live for your honesty. Long live for your individualism and fierceness. And so the polite thing when someone like me says to you, mabuhay, is to say back to me, mabuhay. Mabuhay. All right. And so the next time you hear that from an individual, I welcome and also invite you to say it back. So I say mabuhay to all of you, and how beautiful it is to see all of you here today. I also want to acknowledge, and I feel incredibly privileged and humbled by being asked to participate on the Elders Council and to provide remarks prior to our next session here. For those who aren't aware, I do a lot of education, and for the last 6 years, I've been delivering education on LGBTQ2S plus communities. In fact, I'm going to be running to the Duckworth Center right after this to do a presentation for Basketball Manitoba, who has created policy to include trans folks. And so to deliver it in front of all of the basketball coaches is a real opportunity and really kind of a treat as well. I also wanted to provide a bit of reflection. We were asked to provide just a bit of personal reflection that's relevant to the topic. And I remember when I was 17 years old, it was my second Pride, and I was at the Legislative Building, and I saw an individual who identified as a woman to hold a sign that says, "One man, one woman." And it was during the time when a handful of us were advocating for same-sex marriage or the rights for those to marry those of the same gender. And I walked up to her, and there was a group of us, and I was part of the youth group, and I said, that's okay. And I walked up to her, and she was holding this sign, and she looked at me, and I remember her being much taller than me. And I said to her, "What are you doing here?" And she said that I was an abomination. But I said to her that what she was doing was hurting me, and it made me feel bad about myself, and it made me feel anxious. And I don't remember exactly the words, but I remember those certain words. And it made me feel very sad. I remember saying that, and I felt very lonely when I saw those signs. And in my sadness, in my loneliness, and in my anxiety, I said, that makes me feel suicidal. And so what you're doing in the name of what you're doing is making me feel suicidal. How do you feel about that? And she said, "I didn't think of it that way." She said, "If we allow same-sex marriage, my fear is that the Bible would be deemed as hate literature." And in that moment, I recognized that the Bible for her was her identity. And so from a compassionate to a compassionate sense, my hope was to talk to her about that as well. I said I was raised Roman Catholic, and I remember the parable of the Good Samaritan, and reminded her about that. And I said, can you please think about that? because what you're doing is hurting me. And as Christians, isn't that not the purpose? That's not the purpose. And she nodded, and she said, I need to think about that. And I remember walking down the steps, and I remember tears, I guess through all the adrenaline and the fear, I started to cry. And I turned around, and I remember looking at the folks who were doing all the speeches, and I saw her sign go down, and I saw her walk away from the rally. I don't remember what happened after, but I wanted her to stick around to hear the rally, but she decided to put down her sign, and she walked away. And that was the moment that I realized that words are so incredibly powerful. What we do and what we say, our existence, is incredibly powerful. And that became the road of education to me. Many of us who are either who do formal education or who speak our truth every single day faces a hazard to our mental health, to who we are as individuals, and for some of us in our vulnerabilities, it may put us in a place that questions who we are and what we're doing. And so when I see educators, all of us who are sitting in this room are educators, how important it is for all of us to stick together, how important it is for all of us to lean on one another and to cry together and to laugh together and to share in our joy in one another and to dance together and make love with one another. How important it is for all of us to think about that and to remind ourselves that we're not alone, that yes, while we do speak our truth or live our truth, that we're here for a purpose, that our existence is purposeful, and that we matter. And in my community, and this is a bit of now education with not just the Mabuhay, but the Mabuhay greeting. But in my country of the Philippines, we were colonized 3 times by the Spanish, Japanese, and the U.S. And we were known as the Tao people before we were called Filipinos. We were also known as third spirit people in the English term. And so I come to you as a third spirit person with my authenticity and my integrity and my dignity. And a third spirit person, similar narratives to two spirit people, but still doesn't capture, it certainly doesn't capture from a Western lens. I can't even explain it from an English sense what that means, but I only really come to the term, to the identity as of last year, because the term gay or trans or non-binary just didn't fit who I was. It just didn't fit. And for many of you who have known me over the years, it's very difficult for me to even say trans, because that doesn't fit my identity. But certainly, being a third spirit person from the traditional Filipino culture is what fits. So if you hear me say that I'm third spirit or a third spirit person, I'm back to my roots prior to colonization. From an English term, sure, I'll still identify as gay and I'll still love who I love. But that's my authenticity and that's my integrity that I wanted to share with you. And I look forward to not only this panel of education, but I look forward to our conversations one-on-one and also as a group as well. Mabuhay.
Thank you, Reese. I would like to welcome the panel for education up here. So that's Laurie Campbell, who I've not met yet. Laurie, thank you. Laurie Campbell, OmiSoore, Dr. Dryden. Yes, okay. Jade Peaks, Alec Wilson to the stage here, and Camryn. Is Camryn here? Camryn, sorry. So I'm going to introduce the panelists here. So OmiSoore, I told you I'll get it. OmiSoore Dryden is an interdisciplinary scholar who examines the culture and politics of blood. Dr. Dryden's research explores how the history of racism and colonialism face contemporary cultural understandings of blood, health, and tainted, and how these understandings are produced. Dr. Dryden's monograph, tentatively entitled, now this is an older bio, so I don't know if this has already been published, but Blood Apartheids, Canadian Blood Donation and the Queerness of Blackness, centers Black queer transnational diasporic analytics through which diverse set of archives, including donor questionnaires, are analyzed. I don't know about you, but I'm waiting for that book to come out. Jade Peaks. Jade, is that? Jade Peaks, okay, is a 22-year-old urban Mi'kmaq and Black Afro-Indigenous Nova Scotian woman of trans experience, currently serving as a national women's representative for the Canadian Federation of Student. I know that Jade has been, where's Megan? Megan has, our UWSA has, championed you to come, so we're so excited that you were able to make it. Jade aims to continue the work of her ancestors and predecessors, break down the barriers of racialized and Indigenous peoples have faced on a systematic and individual level, all femmes who experience oppression. Laurie Campbell identifies as a two-spirit Métis woman of Cree and Scottish background. Her relatives are from Treaty 6 territory in northern Saskatchewan, but she has spent most of her life in Treaty 4 territory of southern Saskatchewan. Currently, she is the director at Waterloo Aboriginal Education Centre at St. Paul's University College, which is housed at the University of Waterloo. Laurie has a Bachelor of Arts in Indigenous Studies, Bachelor of Arts in Psychology, Master's in Adult Education, and is currently working on her PhD in Social Justice Education at OISE at the University of Toronto. Go, go, go. Carmen? Say it again. Camryn Harlick, thank you, is a two-spirit Métis Crown Word student going into her third year at Ryerson University. Currently sits as the VP Equity, making themselves the first ever elected Indigenous executive and the first trans executive in all 50 years at Ryerson University union existence. Is that deserves a round of applause. They also sit as the Canadian Federation of Students Queer constituency, co-chair representing over students all over Canada, and is the co-founder of the Reproductive Justice Collective. They are passionate about queering the revolution and unpacking settler colonialism in university administration. And then we have Dr. Alex Wilson. Dr. Alex Wilson is from the Opaskwayak Cree Nation. I'm still learning, kids. She is a professor at the University of Saskatchewan. Dr. Wilson's scholarship has greatly contributed to building and sharing knowledge about two-spirit identity, history and teachings, coming in theory, I like that, coming in theory practice, Indigenous research methodologies, and the prevention of violence in the lives of Indigenous people. She is one of the many organizers with the Idle No More movement, integrating radical education movement work with grassroots interventions that prevent the destruction of land and water. She's particularly focused on educating about the connection between land production, gender self-determination, and body sovereignty. This is our panel this morning, and I have to say, this is a powerful panel already. I'm going to ask that I'll let you decide your order, but 10 minutes each on those discussing questions that we have posed and outlined. I don't know if we want to start on this end or on that end, but I'm happy to give you the floor, and we can have a discussion after.
Cool. Yeah, so I was thinking a lot about what I wanted to talk about today. And to be perfectly honest with you, I'm still not completely sure where this is going to end up in 10 minutes, but we'll find out. Last night, I was really thinking about how academia has impacted me as a two-spirit Crown Ward, specifically youth in care. And I wanted to talk about streamlining in education, specifically in high schools and in like college and university settings. For folks who maybe aren't aware of the term, streamlining is when oftentimes we see it with racialized and Indigenous youth when they're in high school or they're going into high school, and folks either on administration or in counseling or all of these different spaces encourage you to go into workplace level courses, no matter depending on your grades. This is something that I've been thinking a lot about recently in terms of access to education, being an Indigenous student in Toronto. Toronto's a huge city. We have tons and tons of people. So why is it when I'm in a class of 300 students, I'm the only Indigenous body in that classroom? I'm the only trans body in that classroom. And I've been thinking a lot about why that is. I was thinking back to high school, and I grew up in a very white, very Catholic town in southwestern Ontario, on traditional Oneida territory. And all through elementary school, I think I had decent grades. I can't quite remember, but I know I was doing all right. I got like B's, A's, somewhere along there. But for some reason, no matter what, at every step of the process, I was always told, you're not going to be smart enough for university. Give up on that hope of university. You're never going to get there. And I was really interested because like my white friend Sarah with the blonde hair and blue eyes got like way worse grades than me. No shame to Sarah. But everyone always told her that she should go to U of T, that she should go to these big prestigious institutions. And I was always really confused navigating through that because I was like, why, if I'm getting better grades, is this the issue that I'm seeing? And now that I'm like old enough to realize what racism looks like and what transphobia looks like, I'm like, oh shit, that was probably it. I also hope folks are okay with swearing. I do that quite often. I'll try to limit myself. But earlier this week, I was chatting with some of my friends who are also youth in care, and it doesn't just happen at that elementary school level. And if we look at who's disproportionately represented in youth in care, it is our Indigenous youth, it is QPOC youth, it is Two-Spirit youth, and it's primarily Black and Indigenous youth. So there's that added layer of racism in that institution already. But if we look at the way specifically youth in care are not only streamlined into taking courses that they are too smart for lack of a better word, but also if we look at the schooling that youth in care are forced into. I lived all over Canada. Children's Aid bounced me around quite a bit. I lived in 25 different homes in 2 years, and I wasn't anywhere for too long. But the biggest thing that I noticed was that youth in care oftentimes don't even get to go to traditional public schools. So being myself, getting good grades, I was really confused because when I had asked to go to public school and had asked to go to an actual academic institution, I was denied. And I didn't really get that. And I was looking around at the other youth I was with, and it wasn't specifically an Indigenous-only group home, but it was all Indigenous youth. My whole time in care, I never was once placed with or saw a white youth in care, which I'm sure they exist and it definitely happens, but why is it that this overrepresentation is happening? And when we talk about the 60s scoop, and then we talk about now the new term, the millennial scoop, where in Canada, on average, every day, 3 Indigenous youth are being apprehended. What does that mean for representation of youth in care, specifically Indigenous and Black youth in care, in post-secondary education, and even in high schools, when folks aren't even able to take classes because they're moving around so much that you're worrying about where your next meal is going to come from, or where the roof over your head is going to be situated, not your math test that you have next week. If you even have the luxury of being able to take a test in a school. So in terms, going back to the streamlining, it's not just about being conditioned and taught from a very young age that you're never going to get to university. It's also about being streamlined into subpar education that doesn't reflect your spiritual identity, that doesn't reflect your queerness or your transness, and that doesn't reflect accurate representations and accurate histories of Canada. and colonization and all of these different things. And when you are in care and you aren't able to access the internet, like I'm not sure if folks know, but like when you live in a group home, you maybe get 1 hour of internet a week. So like, fun fact, when like Jay-Z cheated on Beyonce, I had no idea because I didn't have a computer or access to internet. And then when Lemonade came out, I was so confused because I was like, what do you mean? But this is the reality that youth in care are going through, right? They're not able to see the supports that they need. They're not able to access those online communities. They're not able to access the supports that they need to be able to do academia in the way that suits them, in a way that's accessible for them. So it's really important to me when we're talking about streamlining that we're talking about the youth that oftentimes get unrepresented. I also wanted to like briefly talk on that about incarcerated youth and how Indigenous and Black youth in care are often forced into incarceration. For folks who like aren't sure about how incarceration works when you're in care, I was incarcerated for 8 months because I missed curfew by 15 minutes at my group home. So it's not that these youth are criminal offenders, that they're dangerous people, that they're doing these bad things, but they're forced into this cycle of incarceration, of poverty, and all of these different things. And I'm sure you can imagine that if you're being incarcerated for missing curfew and you're missing 6 months of school every year, what is that going to look like for your academic future? Because I'm going to tell you right now, youth facilities and youth juvenile systems, your schooling isn't great. It's not going to be the top-notch education that you want to be able to access post-secondary education down the road. It's still possible. I got there eventually. It's still possible. But it's extremely difficult when every step of the way you're told you're just a dirty Indian, you're just a trans person who doesn't know what they're doing, and all of these different things. And it's really important in terms of access to education and youth in care who are incarcerated and youth in care who are living in these group homes and these foster settings. They don't necessarily have role models to look up to all the way. We're also flown and driven hours from our community, so we purposely don't have those role models. In one of the group homes I was in, for example, we were all allocated more than 6 hours away from our home communities, which means like most of the folks were from Kenora and Whitefish Bay, and we were in Guelph. So it was quite the trek. And what does it look like for education for Indigenous youth, not only academia, but also spiritual teachings, access to elders, and all of these different sacred and important things for Two-Spirit youth and Indigenous youth's development when they're actively not only shut out of academia, but also shut out of their own spiritual teachings purposefully. We would be bribed with Tim Hortons gift cards to go to Catholic church and skip school to go to church. If we got those gift cards, which we were only getting $2 of allowance a week, and we would have to pay for our clothes, we would have to pay for all of these different things, you're more worried about getting that $2 and appeasing your group home staff than looking out for your academia, looking out for your future, thinking about goals. Because in that moment, your goal is to just survive another day in that space. So that's kind of what I was thinking about, talking about in terms of that. But then also, once we get to university, what does it mean when there's no services for us to help us on that path? For example, Ryerson University is a big colonial mess. It's a huge disaster. For folks who don't know, we're named after the man who created the residential school system. Our president is like super racist and not great towards Indigenous folks. But what does it mean when Indigenous youth finally get to academia and they're finally able to access these spaces when their professors are racist and calling them out in class? When Ryerson Aboriginal Student Services only has 2 offices and we have 35,000 students. When there's only 4 staff members and they don't do any programmings for Two-Spirit folks. I have the luxury of sitting in a position of power at the university and on the Students' Union, which has been really interesting because I got to run the first ever campaign around colonialism that the institution has ever seen, which to me is ridiculous. We've been around for over 50 years. Why is it that we're just now talking about this? And when that happened, I was, for instance, in a class last week, and a professor called me out in the middle of class, said that residential schools were a gift for Indigenous children, that no harm was caused by them, and that I should be ashamed and should drop out of this university because what am I doing here? In front of our whole 300-person lecture. So it's talking about not only the microaggressions, but also the macroaggressions that Indigenous students face when they're saying, this shit isn't okay. I'm going to stand up for this because, one, no one else is. And we have to, just to be able to survive in these institutions. And the prof was tenured. I tried to complain, but they're like, we can't do anything. And I'm like, of course. He's like white and 60 years old and teaches politics. I'm just petty. But it's just, I've just been thinking a lot about the barriers to even getting there, but the barriers when we're there sometimes can be more harmful, in my personal opinion anyway. Because like when I was younger and I was in group homes and all of those different things, and people said I would never be able to go to university in all of these different scenarios, I'd be like, well, fuck you, I'm going to do it anyway, because I was more rebellious. And I was like, okay, well, I'm going to get here. And the whole time I was going through this process and trying to access this system, I thought university is going to be the time where I'm going to get away. And this shit's not going to happen anymore. And it's going to be a safer space, and it's going to be great. And then you actually get there, and you're like, oh, yikes. This actually isn't as great as I thought it was going to be. And I'm really fortunate now to have switched into a new program. I was in criminology before, which was a mess. But I have the privilege of being in social work now, which at Ryerson, there's an amazing student group called Indigenous Students Rising last year that implemented a whole bunch of amazing demands that the school actually followed to make the social work program way less colonial. They have to do a land acknowledgement before every lecture now, which should be happening anyway. There's a microaggressions policy where we need to be calling out other students, and our professors are obligated to call out students in the classroom. We have to follow an anti-colonial, which whatever that means to the white folks who adopt it, I feel like that's a little bit of a mix-up. But we have to go through all these frameworks. So I was thinking a lot about how as students and how as student leaders and how as community members, we can kind of pave the way for future folks who will be accessing the system. And that's what I've been thinking a lot about. And I would love to chat to folks later if they have any ideas or what folks are doing at their own universities, because it's tricky. It's tricky when, for example, I did a campaign around Canada 150, and I was almost impeached by my entire board and executive team because they said that it was too political and that I shouldn't have done anything, and that it was essentially just a whole lot of not too great anti-Indigenous racism. But when we do try to do this work, the resistance that we're met with. And I read a quote a couple of days ago that said, we will be the future ancestors. And that spoke a lot to me and made me realize, like, what am I doing to make sure that the generations that come after me can access post-secondary education, access high school, access these systems in a way that works for them and isn't harmful in the classroom every single day of their journey. So that's what I've been thinking a lot about. How many minutes am I at? Am I good? Great, because I don't know what else to talk about now. But thank you for listening. I hope I didn't talk in too many circles.
I'm not sure how Canada 150 isn't political, but Tansei Nia Nang Maswa, Nagawi, Montreal Lake Cree First Nation in northern Saskatchewan. I apologize, I have a cold, so I'll have to speak slowly, and my voice is a little off, but Jade, I'm very happy to be here today. It's really an honor to be invited to this conference and to be on such an amazing panel up here. I thought I would talk a little bit about, in the program it said something about sort of how we can transform education, and so I started thinking about, well, why am I doing what it is that I do, and what brought me to this place, I guess. So I went through a K-12 education system, probably not unlike most in the room, and a system that knew nothing about who I was or where I came from or the history of my relatives and the contemporary realities of my peers. It was in a small town in northeast Saskatchewan, rural farming community. I'm part of the 60 Scoop generation, and so I was adopted when I was 2 years old, and I spent the thing that I feel is my biggest accomplishment in my life and most important is that I've spent the last 25 years searching for and locating my birth family, including all 6 of my living siblings. And this search took me a up until a year ago, it's October right now. Is it October still? Okay. A year ago, actually, where I met and reconnected with my last sibling, and I'm the oldest of 8 that were born, and we were spread out from Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, through to Ontario, and several of my siblings didn't know there were others of us, and yeah, so that's kind of been my biggest accomplishment to date, and I took that on as being the oldest in the family, and it was something that I needed to do, and what it turned out for me as significant in it is that I was able to. I had learned because of my process in my file that's this big of communication with the federal and provincial governments over the last 25 years, and who were really no help in this process at all. But I waited until I was able to sit down with each of my siblings one-on-one and to fill in some gaps for them based on what it was that I knew about how it was that they came to be, where they came to be, and how our family came to be in the position it was. And I listened to all of their stories, and I feel like I'm kind of one of the lucky ones, which is really weird to say, but I say it in a sense in that I went to a home where there was there wasn't violence or abuse within the home in a direct way, I guess. I of course, when adopted with the 60 Scoop, the idea was that we would, successfully assimilate. And that was, the intention of what my parents had been led to believe would happen. And they, came from a very benevolent place. And we're told that this is what they could do, and this is how they could help children like me. But I learned that to be successful meant that I had to somehow transform into being Hungarian and Irish. I knew I was Indigenous, and I couldn't quite understand in my brain how that was supposed to happen, how I could go from being Indigenous to Hungarian and Irish, and so I wasn't very successful at the assimilation, and maybe because my Scottish Cree background, my auntie would say I'm pretty stubborn background, but so when it came time to graduate and high school and go to university, I had no desire to go to university. Inherently inside myself, I knew I was Indigenous, and I knew that Indigenous people didn't go to university, so I didn't see any point in trying to go and pretend I was Hungarian and Irish and go to university, because I was going to be destined to fail because I knew I was Indigenous. Fortunately for me, I played basketball and I was pretty good at it. And so I got recruited to play basketball at the university, and so I'm very grateful for that, because that's really what I went to university to play basketball is what I went for. And I took the first year of university, I remember very specifically, I took English 100, Bio 100, Music 100, and this course called Indian Studies 100. This is the early 90s, right? So, and I played basketball, and I did terrible in school because biology had a lab, which didn't seem fair because I was like twice the hours in a class. So I chose that I thought I should only have to go to the regular hours, so I only went to half of it. Music I didn't like because I didn't like the teacher, and it was one of those lectures where it was like this huge lecture hall and hundreds of students, and I just assumed that she wouldn't know if I wasn't there, and I was right. And English I did okay. I like reading and writing, and then the Indian Studies course. And so one day after the end of the first semester, after basketball practice, I went out to the hallway and phoned home on the payphone, because we had payphones then. And I got talking to my dad, and I knew I had to tell him how I'd done in school, and he was quite curious, and so I said I failed biology, and he was not super pleased, but it was okay. He wasn't really a bio guy himself, and then I said, and then I kind of failed music too, and then he really lost his shit, and I can understand, because they paid a great deal of money for me to study music in Royal Conservatory, and I do have my grade 8 in piano and my grade 2 theory, and I failed Music 100 in university. And then I said, but it's okay. Like, I passed English and I'm gonna stay in school. I found something I like and I've picked a major. And so so then he's like, well, okay, well, what are you gonna be when you grow up? And I'm like, well, I'm gonna like study Indians. I'm gonna be like take this Indian studies program as my major. And you have to understand, like, my dad and me and my dad were very close, but he doesn't have a high school education. He's been on the farm his whole life. He's a great farmer, and but just hasn't been exposed to a lot of things. So then comes back on the phone. If you think I'm going to pay for you to go to school to study the Indians, you got another thing coming. There's no way I'm doing that. No, this isn't going to happen. And in my little stubborn sort of style, I said, I waited till he's done. And I said, okay, well, then I'll quit. Like, I'm not going to go to school anymore. And, well, let me talk to your mother about it. So, the end result is they did pay for that degree, and I did continue on, and that really, that program was through the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College at the time. And I distinctly remember walking into the college and seeing Indigenous students and Indigenous staff and faculty and administrators, and I feel like it was this pivotal time in my life where I started to learn about who I was from people who knew who I was, who knew where I came from, and who knew how it was that I ended up adopted into the home that I was adopted into. And it was this whole other different education that also really led me to feel that I could be Indigenous and I could be successful in whatever way that meant, and that I deserved to be in university. There was one professor in particular. I wasn't, Two-Spirit, I think somebody mentioned, like, the term, I think, just came out in the 90s, early 90s, and so I wasn't identifying as Two-Spirit. I knew I was different, and I knew I liked my girlfriends, but in order to hang out with my girlfriends who had boyfriends, I had to get a boyfriend so we could go out all together so I could hang out with my girlfriends with boyfriends with my boyfriend. But it was really, a lot of strategy and trying to figure out how to get with my girlfriends. But it worked. I had one professor in particular who spent a lot of time with me, and at the time I think I thought it was because he had a younger daughter who was in the K-12 system still, who played basketball, and I think I thought it was kind of that. But a decade later I realized that she's Two-Spirit as well, and I think that he kind of saw that in me, and he just took that extra time with me, and it wasn't, certainly wasn't anything we talked about, but it was just a space where I knew I could be who I was. So all of this, I guess, sort of led me to where I am present day at the University of Waterloo, which is the director of the Indigenous student education. And to be honest, it's a very new position. I've only been there for nine months, and I'm very happy to come back to the prairies. In fact, this is the third time that I've had to come back because it is very different. It's very much a culture shock for me to move so far away from my family, my community that I know. But while I was in Saskatchewan, I was fortunate to really have a couple of elders that I spent a lot of time with over the last decade or so who recognized who I was and who provided space for me to be who I was within ceremony with those particular elders. And I think because of that, I chose not to, I got to choose where it was that I didn't go and the spaces I didn't go into that weren't going to have me in the circle. And so I feel very, very lucky to have had that at the time. But as I moved over to Waterloo, in my interview process, I was clear in that I was Two-Spirit. And I did that for myself. Because I didn't want to pack up and move halfway across the country if that was going to be a problem with the people that I was going to work with, and so at least that's what I thought. So I did it. I thought I did it for myself to move out there, but I also came to realize that I did that in every interview room they had me in, which was there's several different ones, right? Staff, faculty, students, and I did that in every room that I went into and with every group that I spoke to, and so I got the job and I moved out there, and it became very clear to me that not only are many of my staff identifying as Two-Spirit, but many of the students are as well. And I realized that identifying myself as that and taking on this leadership role in the university required a different level of responsibility and accountability on my part in order to fulfill the role that I was hired to do. And I recognize, since I've been out there, that students and staff have been outside the circle in many circumstances, and that some of the things that are going on at the university are very specific, as in protocol for dress and things like that. And I recognize that I was okay in sort of taking myself and choosing myself where it was that I was going, but I can't be okay in perpetuating that and being complacent in that at where I'm working. So yeah, so I guess that's kind of where it's led me to be today, and I do have hopefully in Q&A when we talk a little bit more, I do have a couple of things that I am participating in trying to make some change. But it's also it's tricky too, because it's different than the work that I did out in Saskatchewan, because I was so intimately connected in Saskatchewan, and I recognize that I'm in a new territory. And there's a lot of differences there, and so it will take time for me to be able to build the relationships that I need to build in order to have some of the conversations that we need to have out there. The other thing that Camryn and I were kind of chatting there yesterday, and that I also realized is that it really seems apparent to me that there's a lot of Two-Spirit people in leadership positions, like I will say, like, disproportionately maybe, but in leadership positions in post-secondary institutions. And it brings me to wonder about whether or not that's happened by accident, or whether or not it has really more to do with our authenticity and our roles and who we are and what we can do within the community. And that brings me back to the time when I went to the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College, and I learned, that idea that I learned about who I was from people who knew who I was, and how pivotal that was in me being where I am today. And maybe this is another piece of what leadership needs to happen and can happen within those spaces and places. And maybe if students, young people, become aware that we hold that space in post-secondary, that they can get through some of those other times that are really troubling, and look forward to coming and joining us. And just as an aside, it's significant I did 2 undergrads, because I didn't think people like me then went to grad school. And so it was never an option. Nobody ever told me I could go to grad school, and so I signed up for another undergrad. So thank you.
Kwek dalasi da Jade Peak Dulewig Migamawach Antigawachwech Migamawach. Hi everyone. My name is Jade Peak. I am Black and Mi'kmaq. It's really interesting. Antigawachwech means Black woman in Mi'kmaq. It's when I am at a process of trying to relearn the language and learn the language, and when I heard that, I was really shocked and really excited. And there's a lot of words that relate to Black people in Nova Scotia. And so that's where I'm from. I'm from Nova Scotia, and I'm really excited to be here. Please put on a timer, because I'm probably going to talk longer than 10 minutes. But I'll try to keep it short for everybody. How's everybody doing? Great, yay! So I thought I would start with a little bit of history. So as I said, Antigawachwech means Black woman in Mi'kmaq. And so in Nova Scotia, as many may or may not know, but Nova Scotia was the first place where Champlain sailed his little ship in a little town called Port Royal, and then it got burnt, and then it got rebuilt again. But what's interesting is from being from mixed ancestry and being a two-spirited woman, the intersections of my identity come from the historical implications of colonization. And so it's hard to recognize, but black folks had arrived 400 years ago in Nova Scotia. So they've lived there for 400 years. And coming from 4 different places, Jamaica, and then from the Akan people in West Africa, as well as coming through the United States as loyalists in the 1700s and the 1800s, and then as well coming in as slaves. My family, black part of my family came as slaves and built part of Halifax and also Louisbourg. I was mentioning earlier today, talking that Nova Scotia is just full of fortresses. And so it's a constant reminder of the violence towards not only the black people who were brought there and forced there, but also the Mi'kmaq people. I think something that's important to notice is Member 2, a great leader of the Mi'kmaq people in 1610, went to France and converted to Catholicism as a way of bridging and creating a negotiation with the French. And so this began a long process of conversion into Catholicism, to many which would bring peace between the Mi'kmaq and the French, but until the British, but then creating an erasure of history. The Mi'kmaq people, our people, my people, the Linu, we recognize two-spirited identity, and throughout the past 400, 500 years, that has been lost. And so we are now at a resurgence time, and I'm lucky to be alive at a place where I can be held. But it's been very difficult. Somebody was cutting the freaking onions this morning. To be held by so many two-spirited elders is something that is very rare from my hometown in Halifax. Just a little bit about myself. I was born in 1995. I'm quite a beautiful little baby. Oh, can you not hear me? Oh, I'm sorry, folks. Oh, is this better? Woo! So I was born in 1995, and so I was born into a complicated family. I didn't know my biological father. I was grown into a military family, and so the father that was on my birth certificate was a white man. And then my mother, she was someone who was adopted and taken away from her home of 12 children, also part of the 60 scoop. And so she went to Ontario and then came back. But the way that she had grown up, she began to erase her indigeneity and also erase her blackness. Because of her lighter skin, she had to straighten her hair every day. And she became subject to abuse, impacted the way that she began to hold me and raise me. And so growing up, I didn't have many opportunities to be held by my community. Sometimes I would be at the church. I grew up in a Baptist church, so I grew up primarily with a lot of influences from the black side of my family. And the time I would spend with my aunts, my great aunts, we'd all play cards, and it was really great. I love Scrabble. And so I was able to connect with my culture. But the problem with connecting with my black culture was it was very homophobic and transphobic, and so it didn't hold me in the ways that I should have been held, and so it tore me away from that community. But not only that, my mom, she was very abusive to me and my sister. And not because she didn't love us or didn't love me. It was because she didn't want me to end up in poverty. She didn't want me. She would consistently use examples of my uncles and my family members to try and dissuade me from being proud of being black to being proud of being Mi'kmaq. And so she hid it. Obviously, I looked at my skin and I was like, well, I really can't hide it. But she tried. So I went to a white school. Primarily, it was a K-12 school and public school. And my journey throughout specifically elementary was really difficult. I tell this story often, but I was in grade 1, and my hair is naturally very curly. It's really poofy. I love it. I love my hair. I love my body. But my teacher didn't like it. And in this time, this was early 2001, the school was still partially segregated. Nova Scotia didn't segregate schools until 1982. And then, of course, the last residential school in Nova Scotia shut down in 1996. And so Nova Scotia was very new to having people and people of color into their school programs. And so I remember her grabbing me by my hair and calling me a dirty, 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 dirty little child. And she took me to the principal's office. Actually, she didn't send me to the principal's office. What happened was she took a student and gave the student a note. I had to go to the principal's office. They sat me down, and then I went in, and then they took my hair, they took me, it was the secretary and the principal, they shoved my head in a water basement in the back, they washed my hair, and then they cut all my hair off. And that was my first experience of feeling racism in a very physical way, in the way that I noticed my blackness, but also my indigeneity. But it was around the same time that I started realizing who I was inside and realizing that the body that I was in wasn't quite the body that I felt that I was supposed to be in. And talking to my family about it, because my mom really, 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 really wanted me to be successful and to go to school, she didn't allow me to do many things. And so when I told her that I was, at the time, identified as trans, and I still use that term to speak to white people, but she didn't like that. And so she sent me to a reversion therapy, and I was subjugated to that for about 2 years. And unfortunately, this was during a time where I was going through my puberty. And so the doctor, I remember his name, Dr. Swain, he tried so hard to tell me to do the things to be a man, which wasn't at all what I wanted. I was there to talk about the abuse that I was going through with my family. I thought I was there to receive some help in navigating my feelings, but all it was a way to indoctrinate me into to feeling comfortable in the body that I was given, but not the person that I could be. And so it was really difficult, and not until later I didn't realize, but the ways that he had engaged with me were sexual assault. And so the effects that has taken now me as a 22-year-old there's things that I can't change, and there's only so much that medication can do, and only so much that healing can do. But it's hard when you can't be held by your community, because the processes of colonization, you can't be held by your community, and then when you go to try to turn to school, you can't be held by your school. And so in 2009, my friend Jasmine, we would talk to each other because we both, she was black and I was, and so we connected through that way, but she was also a trans woman. And so at that time, that is what she identified as. And she was dealing with so many issues within the church that she was going to and within her family, and she also went through a similar reversion therapy by her parents, but it didn't work, and she ended up committing suicide on December 12th, 2009. And it was a really hard time for me. It was a time where I was like, I am not okay in being a queer person. I can't do this. And so I hid myself. I hid myself until I started university. I was like, no, I'm going to cut it out, until I finally felt my self-determination and put my foot down and said, no, this is who I am. But I'm giving that little backstory of kind of some portions of my life to tell you how important it is to hold community and also to make your own spaces. It's taken me a while, 3 years, to realizing that sometimes it's hard to find community, but we can find community around us. Look around the room. Look to the person to your left. Look to the person to your right. It's amazing. You can create your own table. You don't need to have a seat at the table. I think being in post-secondary education, being involved with the student movement for 3 years, I'm currently the National Women's Rep for the Canadian Federation of Students. I am the first trans woman ever to sit in that position. Hold applause. No applause. Don't applause. that's not okay. The fact that it took that long, I continuously, although I mentioned that, I'm not a token, and I will never be a token. I try to represent all femmes to the best of my ability, and it's hard in education. And so there's been a lot of work that I've been trying to do at my own home to not only hold me, but to hold people, and to create community spaces, and to re-educate my own people. Black Nova Scotians, specifically the Black Nova Scotians, have been forced to live in this binary. And as much as the church has been a huge support within that, there's a lot of work that is being done and needs to be done to decolonize the church and decolonize our hearts and decolonize our spirits. And I think, as well as us Lanu, we are slowly moving in that direction. Can you believe it? Eskasoni, it's a Mi'kmaq reserve in Cape Breton. People don't know what I'm talking about, but it is a reserve, and they just had their first Pride Parade, and they marched through, and it was led by two-spirited people. And it was incredible to witness that. Why did it take to this point in time? And so I come out west, and I see the way that sweat lodges are being held, the way that two-spirited people are being held. And then I go back home, and there's still, and the sweat lodges, there's one for men and one for women. And half the time, there's never a sweat for a woman. And so there's been so much activism trying to decolonize, but we've been colonized for so long. It's been since 1604. It's hard. And so I think it's important as youth to hold space for not only the elders that we learn so much from, but for each other. And I think that in a post-secondary education system, it's oh, my phone, it fell. I got some notes for y'all. I think that we've been doing a lot of work, at least in my institution at NASCAD, where at one point, I remember a professor, we were smudging, the Indigenous collective, and so we were having a smudging, we were trying to heal, and the professor comes in, and he's just like, "You're not supposed to be smudging in the painting studio." And part of my language, we were like, "Too fucking bad." So it's been, even at my institution, when I first came, there was no Indigenous minor, and now Indigenous pedagogy and methodology is now being taught. And so that's great that we have the courses, we have the syllabuses, we have all of those things, but we have to hire Indigenous faculty. That is something that is quite crucial. We also have to hire Black faculty. There ain't no way that we're having some white person come in and teach our methodologies. And I think there's something that is important, and that is that in order to decolonize education, in order to include our complex identities of being two-spirited, of being queer, of being Indigenous, of being a person of color, is that we all have different ways of knowing. And so if you are hiring somebody, you have to push for traditional knowledges and ways of knowing that isn't totally attuned to academics. And I think there are many people that I know that have so much knowledge, but they're forced to get a PhD even to lecture at an institution. That needs to change. I think that post-secondary education is a great avenue for us to be able to pursue, but even myself, I'm really excited to be in school. But I often think to myself, I'm like, I would love to just open up my own school and just teach and hold my community, love my community, tell them every day that they're beautiful, and to just feel free. And I think that in order to change academia, we need to change it about learning to decolonize ourselves, learning to be better people, as opposed to learning how to survive capitalism. And so I think that, university is meant for us to survive capitalism, to achieve in capitalism, and know what education should be is for us to be able to share, to be able to feel, and to be able to learn about ourselves. I should be able to go to school and learn about myself. I should be able to go to school and not learn about get the information that is incorrect about my own history. The reason why I'm going to school right now is to rewrite the history that I've been lied to. It took me to university to realize half these textbooks from the 80s and 90s are wrong, and they're still freaking using them. Update it. Get some Indigenous authors in there. Get some Black artists and authors in there. Let's get some people of color in there. And so I guess I'm going to tone it down for a minute. But I think that I am open to chatting anytime during this conference. But I think I'll leave with this. I think that there is a lot of work that needs to be done in accepting intersectionality, our complex identities within post-secondary education. And it's hard. It's hard that we are the ones to put and hold all of that emotional labor. That is so much work. Getting out of bed is so much work, but we do it. We live our lives and we hold each other. And so I think for me, we can talk about ways of implementing queer and two-spirited and QT BIPOC experiences within pedagogy. But I think what's really important is that you're able to take care of yourself and heal and have that self-care. Because if you don't do that, then we won't be able to keep up the fight. Thank you. Walalan. Walalio.
Can you help me out? I'm going to stand and do something. Can you hold the mic? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Majuba. Majuba Oludamari Olaroon. Majuba Urumala. Adupwe Bera Petu. Omi Tutu. Ile Tutu. Ona Tutu. Il Tutu. Tutu Odara. Majuba. Majuba Ifa. You're beautiful. Thank you. So I write things down so I can state a time limit and so that I can get through what it is I wanted to say. I want to begin by, well, I've already begun. I want to respectfully acknowledge our collective ancestors, Indigenous, Black, queer, trans, genderqueer, gender nonconforming, and two-spirit. Those who were born here, those who were forced here, and those who continue to make home here. In particular, I call the names of Black, queer, and trans community ancestors: Sharona Hall, Sumaya Del Mar, Jasmine. May you all continue to walk good. Thank you for the invitation to participate. It's an honor to be here and for us to think collectively and collaboratively. And I was asked to speak about anti-Blackness. So in my academic research and my political work, I study Blackness, blood donation, and blood safety. And specifically, I explore what it means to claim Black diasporic queerness as an analytic and a political practice. And I use this practice, I think through Black queer diasporic analytics in a way to disrupt homonationalisms and also anti-Black racism. As we know, Black people in Canada remain in peril as a result of the continued correlations between the abject and the Black. And in exploring the life of Black people and our experiences, it's necessary it's necessary to interrogate how interlocking systems of oppression, racism, colonialism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, classism, and disablement converge within our lives and upon our bodies. And these active and ongoing systems of oppression frame the conditions of erasure, which produce a sense that blackness in Canada is an impossible image, right? You can't actually think of the ideal Canadian as a black Canadian. And that is imagining black people becomes just too far, it's too impossible. So Christina Sharp, in her book, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being, and if you haven't read it, go now, move as quickly as possible. She states, "The past that is not past reappears always to rupture the present," end quote. So it bears repeating, and often, that slavery in Canada has lasted for a long-ass time. Excuse me just a moment. And so we need to continue to think about our political considerations by remembering and centering slavery and blackness in Canada. The afterlife of slavery continues to impact the social and political realities, not just of black life, but of all of our lives in this region. And here I'm actually talking about not just black folks who were forcibly brought here, black folks who've always already existed here, but black folks who continue to come here and make home here. So Saidiya Hartman talks about how our lives continue to be devalued by anti-black racism. And I would add that the invisibility and hypervisibility of black people in Canada is just one specific example of how the afterlife of slavery manifests. And this is a notable Canadian manifestation. Yet, with this invisibility, hypervisibility in Canada, we continue to see, and I quote Saidiya Hartman when she says, "The skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment. These are all outcomes of slavery." Thus, the presence of black people in Canada, in this region, are engaged as if it's a dilemma, as if it's a problem, as if it's an afterthought, as if we are an afterthought. So my commitment and interest in my life, in black life, is about the disruption and rupture of the Canadian colonial project, anti-black racism, and the afterlife of slavery. So in discussions of Indigenous sovereignty, we often hear references to and the importance of land. Yet if we are to talk about black sovereignty, we need to speak about water. The black was created and made during the Middle Crossing, a Middle Crossing that brought us eventually to Turtle Island. So how do we reconcile the discussions of Indigenous land and the continued unspoken presence of black water? So as I stated elsewhere, black people in Canada are familiar with two questions. Where are you from, and why are you here? What are you doing in here? Are you supposed to be here? Who's the person that's supposed to be watching you? And then when speaking about racism, what do you mean, and are you sure? These are not isolated queries. They have instead become a standard part of most conversations between black people and not black people. These questions happen alongside people touching my hair, or shit like, "You're cute for a black girl," or claims of black friends, alongside the belief that there's such a thing as reverse racism, or that equity policies and practices have gone too far, and the racist response, "All lives matter." Black liberation is relevant and necessary in the 21st century, and it must remain a viable project. And so I want to think through what we learn about the impossibilities of belonging through the experiences of black, queer, and trans people in Canada. And I use the language queer and trans they're white supremacist terms. When I think about the ways in which Black communities create space for same-gender loving, same-sex loving, same-sex fucking, same-gender fucking relationships, this language of queer and trans or LGBTQ doesn't quite capture it. They are colonial terms. And so when I think about our own indigeneity, maybe that indigeneity is also out of water, or if we work to connect to African Indigenous spiritual practices for our liberation, then I also think about the ways in which we can exist as Black, queer, and trans people, again, the limits of language, that are outside of those normative framings. So these I want to talk a bit about hopes of inclusion, be there legal, political, or social commitments to securing inclusion. I would argue that these don't necessarily disrupt the anti-Black practices of homophobia and the racism and sexism inherent in that homophobia, nor has securing legal and civil rights shifted these practices. This is made evident through the use of diversity and inclusion policies, practices, and discourse. The use of diversity is a strategy that serves to manage normativity, harmony, and civility, but ultimately does not facilitate a disruption of these systems. The baseline in the work of diversity is maintaining the status quo. And if we know the work of Melinda Smith, we know that inclusion policies serve and benefit white people, white women, white queers, white people with disabilities, white visible minorities. So diversity work produces a culture of silence and in effect attempts to gesture to something that doesn't exist. And all of this, I think, is an outcome of Canada's multiculturalism praxis. So when we raise issues around anti-Black racism, we're thought of to be disgruntled, we're not thought of seriously, and I can talk a bit later about my experiences in my own job, or experiences I've had in the classroom, where the only Black voice in the classroom is mine, and all of my students are white, and what does that mean? We're already talking about anti-Black racism as a framework of colonization in this region. I also want to think through the anti-Black racism that tends to frame Black people as settlers. We need to really stop doing that. That is a violence. Black people are not settlers, and I will throw hands. I want us to think through the ways in which inclusion policies and the desires to be included work in a way to engage in the hegemonic bargains of belonging. And I'm not saying belonging is a bad thing, but what I am saying is that we need something other than belonging in order to disrupt the colonial presence of education. We need to think anew about disrupting education. So who do I go to for that? When I think anew, I think about Black, queer, and trans communities in Toronto that were vibrant from the 70s. I think about Aya, I think about Sepia, I think about the Black Women's Collective, I think about the work of Sharona Hall and the life of Samael Damar. I think about Makeda Silvera, Dion Brand, Faith Nolan, Angela Robertson. I think about my crew and my tribe who do this work in HIV. That's about fighting for our lives. And I think about Black Lives Matter. I think about the work that Black Lives Matter has done in Toronto and the ways in which that they have engaged anti-colonial practices in partnership with Indigenous communities, and the ways in which they have held space to think anew. And I think about the importance of disruption, the importance of interrupting, the importance of dismissing and letting go of the need to be respectable. And I think if we can think through those ways, Kathy Cohen calls it a politics of disrespectability. I think if we can think through those ways, then we can think differently about what happens in the university classroom, in education in a traditional sense, in a colonial sense, and we can think through the ways that our lives, Black lives, can thrive. Thank you.
Thanks to the other panelists. It's okay, we have the trickster in the house. I'm kind of overwhelmed right now because I'm taking in what everyone else has said, and really powerful words, so thank you all for sharing. Did anyone get to see that meteor shower last night? Nobody? Even with all the Facebook reminders? Well, I wanted to maybe start there because we've had an education system on this land for a long time. Not just, 50, 100, 200, 1,000, 10,000, 20,000, for tens of thousands of years. And that education system worked quite well for us. In fact, it was ideal, right? Because it allowed us to survive, but not just survive, but, really thrive, using the language that you used. And in a very short period of time, things changed. But I kind of want to go back to that original system because we still have that knowledge here. And some of you know I focus on land-based education, and one of the reasons why I do that is because I think it can really validate our queer identities and our queer history. And so I link back to that meteor shower last night because the constellation that it was around was, in English, Orion, right? All of you know that constellation. It's up there in the sky every night. But in Cree, that constellation is known as Wisagijak. And the term Wisagijak in Cree, the first part of the word means sour or tart, and Cree is a very sexual language too, so there's always a metaphor in there. The last part of the term, Achak, means star. But if I were to say Kitachak, that would be your spirit. So there's an understanding that our spirits are connected to the wider universe, right? And quite literally, even Western science says this, that our bodies are made of materials that have come from stars. Carl Sagan says that, but that's part of our Cree understanding as well. It's right there in our language. And the trickster Wisagijak, like many of your cultures, if you go back far enough, you'll have a trickster character. Well, that character is important because it reminds us that on the highest spiritual level, there really is no such thing as gender. So we as humans have created that. And Wisagijak can change forms. It can be a tree, it can be an animal, a plant, a person, a human in any body form. So in that is a reminder that we are all here because we're supposed to be here, and in the forms that we are in, it's perfect. And we can change that form as well because shape-shifting is a part of it. But one of the other keys about the term Wisagijak and the constellation is that the middle part of that term is the root word for love, sagihi. So sagihiwewen is a natural law. And by natural law, it doesn't mean like we have these 10 commandments that, that people follow. It just means that It's the thing that's allowed us to be human for all this time. It's the definitive of what it means to be human. And so there's an understanding that love is that continuity of energy that connects us from now to the past. And it is really significant that there was a meteor shower around that constellation because, as you all know, when we see stars or when we see meteors, stars kind of moving around, that happened a long time ago. So even though we're seeing it now, it actually happened a long time ago. So in fact, those things that we see in the sky every night or last night, part of them are already in us. So that's how we have this understanding of, or sometimes we call it intuition or whatever, but we can also call it love, and that's always connected to land. And so that's what I think about when I hear the term resurgence, is being able to reconnect, tap back into that Indigenous knowledge. And in a very short period of time, a lot has changed, but we still have that knowledge that's there, and land is one way to reconnect to it. We're sitting here near the Red River. Red River connects to Lake Winnipeg. Lake Winnipeg is the 10th largest freshwater lake on the planet, #1 endangered because of all the phosphates from fertilizers going into from farms, draining into the water. Lake Winnipeg runs into Cedar Lake, and there's a dam there, Grand Rapids Dam. Grand Rapids Dam is Cedar Lake's connected to Moose Lake, and Moose Lake's connected to the Saskatchewan River system. So I'm kind of taking you back to where I'm from. So that's the journey we're going this time. So the Saskatchewan River Delta comes all the way from the Rockies, and all the water, flows east from there. Saskatchewan River Delta is the largest freshwater delta on the planet, one of them. The other one's the Amazon. So it's considered to be one of the lungs of the planet, and also endangered. So we have muskeg, and we have the boreal forest that filters the air, that filters the water. And it's really important for people to know that our boreal forest is being deforested at a rate faster than the Amazon is. And the waters have been contaminated as well. So when you think about dropping like a food coloring into water, it kind of dissipates, right? Well, the opposite is true with contaminants. When you drop contaminants into the water, when cities like Calgary, Edmonton, Saskatoon, Prince Albert all put their contaminants into the water, the effect is cumulative. So the people living downstream bear the brunt of the burden of capitalism and the connection to the destruction of land. Same with people, all the waters that are flowing north from here. So all the waterways are regulated by corporations such as Ducks Unlimited. And if any of you were around in the 80s, maybe Barbara, yay, you might remember that, that there was a referendum in Manitoba where people voted, should we connect all these waterways to the Garrison diversion right next to Standing Rock? And Manitoba said no, but all the connectors are there. So this is important because there's a parallel between the ways that colonization, the process of colonization, has regulated water bodies. There's a parallel to the way that our human bodies have been regulated. And this regulation has been asymmetrical, meaning that there are certain bodies that are bearing the brunt of this regulation. And those bodies are queer or two-spirit people. And so it's really important in our education system to kind of ground this in the knowledge of place. So I don't know what else I wanted to talk about, but I had notes here, but I kind of went off track a bit.
That's okay. Hello. What we wanted to have is a bit of a conversation with all of you, so thank you for setting us up for that. This is a fantastic panel for education resurgence. I don't think I've been on a panel where it looks like this. Just simply, it looks like this. So we need to start there, right? But I want to talk to you about the resurgence part, the calls to actions part. That's what we're missing. That's what we want to, all of you bring to the table, to education, all your expertise, all your leadership. What do you need, and what do we need going forward in education? You're a land-based, I know you're fighting the good fight in Saskatchewan, right, for your PhD program. But what are the other programs that we need? What can we do? And I want to open that up to all of you.
I'll start if you guys don't mind, because I have a couple of slides. This was a couple of years ago. We did what was called the Queer Manifesto. There's two slides. The first one's the Queer Manifesto, and this was in direct response to the question that you're asking. And I can read them off for those that may not be able to see. One is to address the interconnections between misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, classism, ableism, and racism. Address the damage that lateral violence does to individuals and communities. Call out and name perpetrators, individuals, institutions, and corporations. Name racism, sexism, classism in the queer community. Name misogyny and homotransphobia in Indigenous communities. Stop celebrating allies and instead acknowledge the bodies and peoples who have been most impacted by colonial violence, and acknowledge Indigenous understandings of sexual and gender diversity. And this one came about because there were all these awards that these white straight guys were getting for being queer allies. And anyway, 7, address the connection between violence against bodies to violence against the land, but stop equating violence against physical bodies to resource extraction. When discussing, researching, teaching, writing about suicide prevention, include the impacts of Two-Spirit on queer, Two-Spirit, trans people. Include Two-Spirit and trans people in any and every discussion about murdered and missing Indigenous women and the inquiry process. And celebrate fabulous queer youth and adults. The next slide was a call to action by youth. So there was a GSA summit in 2016, and Marjorie and I were both there, and this is what the youth had to say, and they asked us to share this wherever we go. This is their calls to action. I think the youngest one there was 8 or 9, and the oldest one, other than us, was 18. So the hashtag they came up with, there was 3 of them: smudge, don't judge, make it happen, and queer it up. Respect different worldviews, support one another, and hold each other up regardless of identity. I can't read what that other one says there. Appreciate and accept that names, labels, identities can change and are fluid. Ask, don't assume. Don't gender activities. Don't enforce, I think it says binary dress codes, yeah. And that was a big one in the discussion. Respect the pronouns of others. Oh, actually, I think I have it on here. Appreciate, oh, sorry. Something about educating elders around Two-Spirit issues. Fight or reject homophobia, heteronormativity, and actually I can't read this either. Learn to be an ally, be an ally. Basically, they're all around challenging heteronormativity and address the effects thereof on queer, Two-Spirit, and trans individuals. Be bold, question assumptions about gender and sexuality, and normalize queer people and relationships. So as you can see, the youth are really articulate. They know what they want, and we continually, as adults, have to keep up with the language and their understandings, because most elders, I would say it's safe to say, don't have a background in queer theory, but I would say that kids in the GSA do. And so that's their message from the GSA Summit.
That's excellent. Did someone want to?
I just wanted to add one thing based on what you just said there, Alex, on one of the calls about giving allies awards. I also just had experienced in this last year going to a conference for senior women academic administrators. And I thought I would go because I'm a director now, and so I should go. And I went also because Dr. Shawnee Pete was going to be speaking at this event, and I made the assumption that in my head that going to this event that I would probably be sitting in a room full of middle and older aged white women. And I was correct, and I wanted to see how they were going to respond to what Dr. Pete was sharing with them, because that's kind of partly what my role is at the University of Waterloo, and it all kind of went the way I thought it was going to. But what did actually catch me off guard that I wasn't particularly expecting was that at the evening banquet there were awards that they were giving out, and to young female scholars who had done some great academic work, I'm sure, but the focus on the people that were introducing them, on what they were highlighting that they had done, was really benevolent type work with Indigenous people in a way that it just really bothered me, because again, it's like celebrating people who can choose to take on work in a benevolent way and not really be vested in it or have any intimate relationship with it. And the one in particular, a bunch of the things that they read off that this person had volunteered to do and whatever is pretty much my lived experience in the work that I do on a daily basis, and I would suspect many of us in the room. And yeah, so we need to stop giving awards based on people who are like being kind to us, or inviting us to the table. I loved what you said about the don't just invite us to the table, like we can create our own tables. This is awesome.
Go ahead, Lana. I can hear you.
Yeah, so she was asking about the number 7, address the connection between violence against bodies to violence against the land, which is a popular kind of slogan. It's actually a curriculum too. Nishan, I know the Nishan folks are here. And but stop equating violence against physical bodies to resource extraction. So the reason for that was because women who had experienced physical or sexual violence asked that to remind people that digging a hole with a shovel or cutting down a tree is not the same thing as what they were experiencing being raped or experiencing sexual violence. In some ways, it minimizes their experience of violence. So that's why that one was there.
That's good, Lana? Yeah. Oh. Go ahead, ask your question, love.
Okay, so number 3, calling out and name perpetrators, individuals, institutions, corporations. I wanted to maybe just expand a little bit on, you know, calling out people like within our own communities, and, you know, them kind of having that responsibility to do some of that work. There is a lot of like homophobia within Indigenous communities because of, you know, Christianization and things like that. So I just, yeah, that's just something I wanted to address. And then also on the other slide, you were saying about elders. You know, me personally, I've dealt with like a lot of experiences with elders and going to ceremonies where they're just like really not informed, like you said, on queer theory. And I just wanted to know like maybe what your thoughts on like how do we deal with that type of situation, because there's always that premise of like respect your elders and don't call them out, even though, you know, it's very frustrating. And so it's like there's two types of values there that are kind of conflicting, and it's hard because I don't want to be a shit disturber all the time, you know?
You're always a shit disturber, Sadie. No. No. Oh, no, it's an important question because we face it all the time, right? And I think for myself, I grew up in Opaskwayak, and I was raised with ceremony, and I never had that experience until I got older. So I know that there's another way. And so that's kind of what grounds me and makes it okay for me, or I feel like I can call things out because I know there's another way of doing things. And I talked about that natural law, Sagi Huewin, around love. But part of that law is speaking up, right? And there are ways of speaking up that can be done in respectful ways without harming or hurting people. But that said, I know how frustrating and hard it is to find a community of elders that aren't going to skirt shame or do other regulation of bodies. And, you know, some of those elders are here today. Especially, I'd like to point out Barbara and Marjorie and Pektanquit and Albert. And when I was like 18 or so, coming to the city here, things didn't happen that way then. There wasn't this thing around skirts. There wasn't this thing around no touching if you're menstruating. So this is a resurgence in a shift to fundamentalism that's come with a resurgence in acknowledging our culture and validating culture. So it's kind of ironic. And it goes back to what you were saying about the multiculturalism model, because the multiculturalism model forces people to think very surface level around culture, when in fact we have deep knowledge systems that have nothing to do with clothing, like really. That's just so minor. And we talk on a spiritual level, like what does clothing have to do with it? And so you know then that those teachings are made up. They're made up by humans. Whether it was a year ago or 10 years ago or 100 years ago, it doesn't matter because it's imposing on your body. And the ethic of non-interference is the way that, you know, that most of us grew up, right? That was the principle. So why is it okay for some old rules to be, you know, brought forward again and others not? So I would think just to seek out the community where you know you're safe, and share that knowledge with your group of friends of, you know of an elder that does not do that, or, you know, that allows everybody, or, you know, that welcomes people and is not going to exclude certain bodies. And then it's a learning process as well, because many of our elders, even if they didn't go to residential school, they have TVs, they walk down the street, you know, they see media, they're impacted by colonization. So we have to be kind of gentle and kind with them as well. And the other thing is, look, we didn't even have a term for elder, right? The term was a kind and loving, no, it would be a kind and loving person. So when you reach that stage, when you emanate kindness, that's what an elder was. So then, you know, let's go with that.
So I want.
Yeah, the cranky and.
Okay, go. Yeah. So, I'm thinking about the kinds of interventions that we can make in and around kind of macro education, the way in which we learn ourselves and teach one another, and how that impacts the systems that we continue to engage in, these continuing colonial systems. And this is why I really want us to think through the creation of the Black subject through the middle crossing, the middle passage, and through a greater study of slavery in Canada. And not as violence porn, but I'll give you a couple of examples about why the inability to think about Black people in Canada impacts the very political work that queer people do. So same-sex marriage, not a huge issue for me, but let me disclose that I am gay married, but not a huge issue. I was anti-gay marriage, but then Gwen. So Gwen happened, now I'm married. Y'all can tell her that too. But here's the thing. When EGAL was, the Equality for Gays and Lesbians Everywhere, was going through the legal and political work to argue for same-sex marriage, they often equated the gay subject to Black people in the United States. They would talk about gay people as being second-class citizens, like Black people in the United States. They talk about gay people not having access to marriage was like similarly being forced to sit at the back of the bus, like Black people in the United States. And so this continual evacuation of Black people in Canada, anti-Black racism in Canada, absolutely structured a gay fundamentalist subject that had nothing to do with Blackness. The inability to think Blackness in that moment, the inability to think about the way that Black, queer, and trans people are living in Canada is because of the choice, the commitment to fervently unknow that slavery happened here and that there's a middle crossing, and that we need to think about the Black subject and the way that Black people came into subjectivity in water, right? So that happened. In Gay Blood, the fact that EGAL and other groups, I'm calling on Canadian Federation of Students as well. Another disclosure, yes, I was the National Women's Chair and National Student of Color Chair back in the day with CFS. But if you look at that work, well, actually, I've looked at that work. What you notice is that they pull out one question from Canadian Blood Services saying if you're a man who's had sex with another man, then you can't donate blood, and that's what the rally has been around. But this idea, no one has, well, I have, looked at this question around if you were born in or lived in Africa, then you can't donate blood. Or if you've had sexual contact with somebody from Africa, you can't donate blood. No sense of an idea that there are Black, queer, and trans people who are not going to be able to donate blood if they simply remove one question because of this remaining question around Africa. No sense that the significations of HIV continue. The way we see it now happening with Gay Blood is, look, we gay people are monogamous and we're married and we go to church and we have families. We are equally the victims of HIV infection. So what does that do? That means Africa, the dark continent, remains the site of infection. There's been no investigation in terms of how infection was moved into continental Africa, right? But only the sense that infection comes out of continental Africa, right? So if we look at the beginning of Gay Blood, when they were looking at homosexuals and Haitians, what has not become public knowledge is that HIV moved out of the global north into Haiti. It did not move out of Haiti into the global north, okay? This deeply resonates with the fact that you cannot think Blackness in Canada. You're like, but they're just geographic questions. And of course, we need to make sure we look at these things, because you cannot imagine that there's a historical presence of Black people in Canada. And the question is dated in 1977. So at what point do Black people get to be of Canada, right? And so these are the ways that we need to actually study Black water and Black enslavement in order for us to have any meaningful intervention, any meaningful, I'm putting it out there, any meaningful anti-colonial practice. If you are not centering and not pairing and not studying the ways in which Black has become the subject through slavery, then you are not doing anti-colonial work. I'm just going to put that out there. So the United Nations has dedicated this decade, the decade for the lives of people of African descent, something like that. There's money in that. But, you know, let me have my Kanye moment. Justin Trudeau hates Black people. Let me have my Kanye moment. Justin Trudeau hates Black people. And so do the systems that continue to support the work that he does, including national gay organizations that are all about this government and all other governments. So do not come to me with this conversation around how we can do decolonial, anti-colonial work if you can't, A, think of Black people outside of this amorphous POC, right? But also think about the ways in which, as my sister here has just said, the long history of Black people on this land. Right? So if Blackness continues to be something that is unimaginable for you, then you continue to perpetuate the colonial practice. And so it doesn't matter what you're doing in the universities. It doesn't matter if you have a Center for Race and Ethnic Relations, which really existed at York University. I worked there. It doesn't matter that you have one Black professor. I'm one Black professor at Thornlow University. Because you have not shifted the systems, which means that violence continues to perpetuate.
I already did, Albert. Comments from the panelists,
Yeah, sorry, I just got a little speechless. There's so much passion. Thank you so much. Thank you, and thank you, and thank you, and thank you. I think when I think about interventions, I often think about P2K, and I think of elementary school. I think that if we are to create interventions so that kids can be held in those spaces and be free, we have to stop policing bodies. We have to stop regulating bodies. And I think it's something that is really hard. So in Nova Scotia, there's been a bunch of campaigns around two-spirited and queer bodies. And so there's been a lot of work to create gender-neutral washrooms within the school, like within the primary schools, within the junior highs and the high schools. But there's also been a lot of work into education and trying to do that work. But the issue is that the teachers that are learning and going to school are not receiving that education. They're not receiving the resources. No matter, you could go to your government, you could go to your legislature, you could pass have someone produce something, and then the Department of Education could adopt it. But unless you're actually teaching the faculty and at these institutions, that work the students can't be held. And that also comes along if the students can't be held and they're not being held at home, or there are families and people that are anti-queer, they're anti-Black, they're anti-Indigenous. This is so hard on people like us who are trying to go through school. And so I think we need to do a lot of work in trying to facilitate conversations with educators. And especially people who've been educating for a long period of time. And it's funny. Some of the elementary schools I've been doing a lot of work with in art education, and so the school, the Department of Education in Nova Scotia has mandated to teach Indigenous arts and Black arts. But the problem is you're looking for, you're doing whatever research you're doing, and then you're getting white or teachers to come in and teach these to the students. But the issue is that you're just getting something, all you're doing is teaching cultural appropriation. You're not actually talking about the significance behind the work, the significance behind the hand and our bodies making these types of work. And so what really needs to happen is bringing people in, paying QT BIPOC folks to come in and show and do that work. And I think that also translates into around our bodies and around being able to hold children. The issue, the thing that people are fighting about and arguing about is that people are too young, and that's because we consistently sexualize our bodies and sexualize and ourselves, but I'm pretty sure when I was 4 years old, I knew I was a woman. I knew what was different. And obviously a child is going to see, let me tell you, I get children asking me so many questions. Children know, they know what's going on. They ask these questions. They are ready to understand these types of things. They may not get it, but it comes with time. But we can't shelter the fact that the world, that we have our complex identities. That comes with time. But children should be able to feel comfortable. QT babies should be able to feel comfortable in growing up and being held. And so and especially if you are coming from a home that is abusive, you try to look for that school, for that place, the only place you can go to get that validation. And so we have a lot of work to do. And so I think that it looks like educating, as I said, faculty, but I also will repeat myself. I think it's about creating our spaces and fostering community. I think it's having workshops with kids, with young kids. I'm currently working on having a conference of beautiful QT BIPOC folks to facilitate a conference for youth. In a space, not maybe similar to this, but something where it's actually around listening to children. We can learn so much from young people about what they're going through. And so it's hard for us to talk about education. We can talk about what it looks like in post-secondary, but unless you are someone who is in the primary education system, it's hard. I graduated from public school in 2013. So I have a little bit of knowledge of what has happened, at least in the land that I am located at. But I think it's important to facilitate that space. And so that work is being done slowly, ever so slowly, but I think caring for each other within spaces we create, but as well as finding ways to educate educators on these things so that they can better hold us.
Yeah, I don't know that they were that brilliant, but they were just more based on where I'm at and things that I saw going on. And so when I went to the university out there, I saw that there was, I think it's called Making Safe Spaces, some sort of workshops that come out of the equity office. And there was one that runs on gender diversity. I can't remember the exact name of it, but and I thought it looked pretty cool, and I did sign up to try and take it to see what it was, mostly because I was nosy and I wanted to see what it was that they were teaching, but it didn't, I didn't end up going. It didn't work at my schedule to go yet, but I had a couple of staff go and asked them if they wanted to go and encouraged them to go if they did, and so they did. They both went to different ones, but both of them came back and said that there was nothing in there about Two-Spirit, and so they found that concerning themselves, and and obviously so did I. So so one of the things that I've done then is I've met with the director over there who it was and the person who's delivering the workshops, and that we will be working on making sure that that is included within those workshops. Yeah, and really, I mean, the reasoning is that it wasn't there to begin with was because they just didn't know anything about it, but also then never actively took action to try and rectify that situation. So that's where I think the problem is. So hopefully moving forward, that will be one thing. And another thing that we talked about, although my events coordinator took a year off here to travel the world, but Sean Johnson back there, but was about trying to arrange a space where we can get together and invite the Two-Spirit people working in the community and within the post-secondary out in Ontario, and then create a respectful space, hopefully, where we can invite the people that that are putting up some of the barriers for us and for the students, and so trying to figure out how we can sort of create a space to have everybody come together and to speak about that. And I didn't catch the name of the person who opened for us, but one of the things that I believe he said was about when he was educating that woman at that rally, and it had spoke about how about suicide and about, you know, some of her actions were sort of creating a space where he felt like that. I think that was really powerful way to have that conversation, and I think I'm hopeful that if we had more conversations like that in a respectful way, that we could just make a change in things instead of having sort of one-offs where students show up somewhere and then they realize that, you know, and it's like, well, you can't come here, you don't have a skirt on, and you can't do this, and so I think we need to be more proactive, and so I'm hopeful that that we can host a gathering like that in the next academic year. But.
Just kind of adding to what you were saying, Jade, about like hiring faculty to teach courses that's their own knowledge. Like at Ryerson, we right now have 2 profs that teach race and ethnicity, for example, and they're both white. And he started his lecture off last week with, he makes the best butter chicken. And that's how we started off his lecture on race and ethnicity, which is absolutely shameful. And that's supposed to be a progressive professor at Ryerson. And I was interested about how many Indigenous faculty that we had. So I was looking into it because Ryerson prides itself on equity, community, and inclusion as their pillars. It's not true. Don't believe the lie. But they do this diversity self-ID every year. The last one they did was in 2014 because they kind of slipped on their equity, community, and inclusion the last couple of years. And they had a breakdown of faculty, and there was a section on Indigenous faculty, and Indigenous staff members, I should say, and it said 3% of staff members were Indigenous. And I was like, okay, I wonder how many professors that is, so you can dig more. But every other tab, they didn't have it broken, they had it broken down by positions. Specifically with the Indigenous tab, they didn't break it down by positions. It said email if you want more information. But every other tab had that breakdown. So I was curious, so I emailed, and the 3%, 0% of that 3% were professors. 0% of that were full-time faculty. The 3% solely came from groundskeepers and custodial staff. And I think if you are an Indigenous student going into academia and you see that, what role models do you have in that situation to want to go further? When the only people who look like you, who are in positions of power at your school, are custodial people, what is that, which no shame to folks who do service work, but what type of example does that set for the Indigenous youth in the classroom when no one looks like them? Luckily now we have one assistant Indigenous professor, Pam Paulnatter, which is great, and a couple other part-time folks right now, but still not one contract full-time Indigenous professor. Especially on a school that prides itself on being inclusive of Indigenous identities, which is actually a laughingstock. I don't understand how they could say that. But I think a recommendation and a call to action is making sure staff in the university are reflective of the student populations. And I think that's so important. But yeah.
you want to say one more thing?
Yeah, I just want to respond to that. I think it's quite interesting. So I go, is there any artists in the space? Anybody who's an artist? Oh, yay, I love this. Let's all talk. So, but essentially, so I go to an art school. It's the only art school in the East Coast. So there's OCAD, which is in Ontario, and I go to NASCAD, Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. And so there are about 700 students there. Out of Black Nova Scotians, there are 2, including myself. And out of Indigenous students, including myself, there are only 10 out of 700. And then there are a few people of color. So primarily the school is white. And so most of the time when I'm there, I wanted to go there and I wanted to study Indigenous art history, and I also wanted to study a survey of Black Canadian art. I was like, yes, this is my time. Until I got there and realized no such course exists anywhere. And I was shocked and I was stunned, and then to come find out that there's only one Black art historian currently working outside of McGill right now, Dr. Charmaine Nielsen, and I was like, she said, oh yeah, she moved to Hart, yeah. Sorry, just segue. So it was really frustrating being in my classes and having to defend myself consistently. I ended up having to be the educator of my own history in order to defend my work and defend my methodology in the way that I created my work. And that's really hard, especially when you have a bunch of white people critiquing your form, critiquing the way that you express yourself, critiquing the way that you express your culture, rolling their eyes and basically just not understanding. And I'm like, this school ain't paying me the big bucks in order to be educating all y'all. And I'm like, and so it's frustrating. And I keep seeing people of color leaving the arts, like going into post-secondary education around like having and the thing is because these spaces, this like art institutions, they have facilities, they have resources so that we can make our work in a cheaper way possible. There are ceramists and people who are making these things and having access to resources and can't do it because they're consistently being attacked and consistently unable to do that work. And the fact that we don't even have one Black faculty member, we don't have one Indigenous a faculty member at all. And so we've been having to continuously put up that fight to try to get these type of methodologies and people who really should be in the school here. And for a large historical Indigenous population and Black population that is situated literally 5 minutes from the institution, it's a goddamn shame that there are not more students there and not the faculty, because I can tell you there are people who teach it. Babies. Thank you.
And then it's important to recognize that there's not a Black Studies program anywhere in a Canadian institution. There's not, like you have women's studies, political science, Indigenous studies. There's not a Black Studies program. There's not actually a national policy on Black life in Canada, right? And so when you have one-off professors, there isn't support in the institution like a Black advisor for new faculty or for graduate students. And so when I talk about these macro systems, these are the ways in which it trickles down, right? And when you do have Black faculty or postings for Black faculty, most of the hires go to African Americans, right? And so there's a job posting now at York University for historical Black studies, but the region is the US, right? So this idea, again, about the way in which Blackness is unthought, this is the impact, this is the outcome of what it means to not have a national commitment to Black life in Canada, and then how that would affect a Black health strategy, or Black research strategy, or Black child strategy, right? These are the things, if we're committed to anti-colonialism, that we need to think through about how we implement those necessary interventions.
Yeah. I'm just, I'm looking at time here, and I know it's going to be amazing. That's 11:30. Do you believe that? No, I don't believe that. We have one question just from the floor over here. If we can have the one question and a response, and then I'd like to move then into our roundtable discussions. I'm really hoping that there's coffee back there and maybe lunch at some point. So I do want to just be aware of the energies in the room as well. So if you can ask your question, then we'll have a response. And then
I want to thank the entire panel. Thank you all so much. I've learned so much, and there was all of the energy as well as the passion and experiences. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'm also reflecting on some of the things that were said. OmiSoore, you just said some really important points. I also think that just like there's a focus on hiring, and there's this investment by institutions to hire African American scholars, there has also, as of recent, been an investment in hiring Native American scholars from the U.S. context as well, right? And so I think we need to challenge those things. I also think about my own role as a Black faculty member, the only Black faculty member in the entire Faculty of Science, actually probably, yeah, the entire Faculty of Science in my university. What it is for students to tell me, you know, I've never had a faculty of color. I've never had an educator of color. I've never had a Black woman teach me before, and what that means for them. And also what I explain to my students, which is like, you know, as much as I advocate and I will ride and die for you, I'm also here trying to survive this system with you. So I can't be your savior. You know, while what folks readily take up the savior complex, I can't do that because I'm trying to survive this system too. And so what that means to be a person of color on the other end as an instructor in these spaces, surviving these spaces, knowing damn well that most of the people who look like you are precariously employed in that same institution, right? And so what that means, so even on the other end of things, how institutionally that functions, where we have to, you know, travel to different places, different provinces that where there aren't a lot of faculty of color to find employment. So all of those sorts of things are the things that are seeping up for me, is like once you are in the academy, all of those sorts of structural barriers, institutional forms of racism, anti-Blackness, anti-Indigenousness, and the way in which Black and Indigenous peoples are pitted against each other by white folks consistently. Okay? I can't tell you the number of times I've had to reaffirm, because I do work with Black and Indigenous peoples, and I also strongly identify as a diasporic Indigenous person, when I have to reaffirm that and argue with a white person that, no, you can't usurp my voice by claiming that, you know, that you're going to prioritize, or you're going to, go to the Indigenous person who's going to agree with you, essentially. And so while I think it's really important to hire Black and Indigenous scholars, I also think the political alignment, the context within which our scholars are coming from. So you can't just hire African American or Native American scholars to usurp and replace local scholarship either, right? And there has to be specific political alignments that we also prioritize. So I think I want us to complicate that conversation a little bit, and the ways in which we're pitted against each other consistently by white people. So just putting that all out there for important conversation is things to take with us as we continue the conversation. And yeah, thank you again.
So I want to thank my sister, Dr. Sian Wilson. If you don't know her work, know her work. If you're planning anything around conversations and relationships between Black and Indigenous communities, then you need to hit up Dr. Wilson and have her come to your space to do that work. Move as quickly as possible to do that. I also want to talk about being what you just mentioned. So in my first year of teaching as a full-time faculty member in a small white liberal arts university in Sudbury, Ontario, I walked into the classroom and as I said, with just white students. And within a month of teaching, I was called into the intern chair's department to be told that I was too hard and that students were dropping out and that I needed to be less rigorous and that I needed to be more accommodating. And so there wasn't any language about the way in which anti-Blackness was working in the classroom with my body. There was an expectation that I would shuck and jive in the classroom, that I would be mammy in the classroom, that I would pat them on the head and be that's okay, and that I would have them suckle at my teat. And as Janelle Monáe says, you know, you need to get off my areola. which is the way I worked in the classroom. And so in the classroom, I was not comforting to white students, and I refuse to be, because too long that's been the expectation of black people, that we will make you feel better about your racism and about your violence, and that and because the way that the human zoo continues to manifest in day-to-day life, that somehow I was okay to be your experiment. You could touch me, you could say bullshit shit to me, and that I would be just okay with that. The way it manifested with my colleagues is when it came to my third year review, they actually wrote things in my review that said, you should do less scholarship, and that you should lighten up, and that you should, do these things. And nobody on the committee thought that any of that language was racist. It was specifically anti-black racist. And then they would frame things like, because you're black, you're getting these problems. Well, actually, love, it's not because I'm black. It's because y'all motherfucking racists, right? It's because of racism. It's not because I'm black. I'm not being sexually assaulted because I'm a dyke and I'm a woman. It's because of misogyny and misogynoir. So stop with the victim blaming by saying it's because I'm black, a dyke, a woman, whatever. Lean all the way from me with that. Right? And let's call it for what it is. And so Sienna's right. Dr. Wilson is right. We have to crisscross the country in order to find in order to find our tribe, in order to find our community, because the sight going into that job every day to be told whatever I'm wearing or however my hair looks, that it is unusual, hence you are unusual, right? To have the first conversation on the new job to be like, I hear a bit of an accent. Are you from the States? This complete eviction of our presence, to have somebody walk up to me in a grocery store and be like, I've never been this close to somebody that looks like you with hair like that. This is the kind of shit that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, and our students are often the ones that are perpetrating that violence against our very bodies. And so this idea that I have power in the university is complicated, to say the least. So thank you, Dr. Wilson.
Anybody else?
I think we can also, support one another and put pressure on about who is being hired, and knowing our positionality and where it is that we're from. And and I don't know that I did the best job of it, but I know when I was on my initial phone interview to the position out here in Ontario, that I did ask about the scope of what they did to try and find somebody local to the area, and that if they had a candidate that was local to the area that had the qualifications for the job, that by all means they should be hiring that person. And I think there's ways that we can try to do that as well, and we should be doing that, and our peers should be doing that as well.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask that we. I'm going to just, there's rich discussion. It's going to be amazing. You're going to write all of these things. Sadie. Go ahead.
Because we're here situated at UW, and we're talking about hiring faculty, I guess my involvement with the Indigenous credit requirement at the UW, I've dealt with a lot of problems when we were talking with a lot of students and faculty about some of their experiences in the first year, it was an evaluation. And I feel like I was a pawn in a lot of sense by the University of Winnipeg by being a young person, by being a student elected, and being Indigenous and all this other stuff. However, on the levels of the institution, like the administration, I had, like, it was torturous being in those committee meetings where they were saying, oh, there's not enough Indigenous faculty out there. And then they're trying to do partnerships with the Turtle Lodge in Sydney, in my own community, and telling them that, like, elders don't get to be professors, or they don't get to teach these courses themselves. They have to be, you know, they have to co-teach with somebody that is accredited. They won't credit Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous, like, our pedagogies in any way. And it's frustrating because that's all Indigenous students keep saying, is that we want to, it's disrespectful for a non-Indigenous faculty member or instructor to teach our history or teach our culture, our ways of knowing, our languages, etc. Which the Indigenous course requirement was trying to ensure, like, majority perspectives. But people in the administration here at the UW were like, oh, let's not antagonize non-Indigenous professors and instructors who put in the work to learn about Indigenous history. And I find that so fucking disrespectful, because our knowledge should not be validated by this colonial institution in general. Our knowledges have been, you know, rooted in the land. They have been rooted for beyond the creation of this country. And they won't they won't validate Indigenous knowledge on the same par of Western knowledge or how that's taught. And it's frustrating because, you know, we're supposed to give to all these non-Indigenous professors how to teach these courses, and it's ridiculous because they won't acknowledge the vast amount of knowledge that is out there. But because we don't have a degree, or we don't have, you know, a PhD, that therefore they're stupid. They don't know, and then they're ill-equipped to educate and teach. And it's one of the most colonialist thing about this university, and I'm so glad I graduated, but I'm pissed off, and I'm glad I survived through this whole institution. But what they're saying, the fact that they're validating knowledge in the way that they think is okay, it does not sit with me, and I think that's the biggest colonial thing that policy and the administrations across, like, Canada, all these institutions need to change, is going into who's making decisions, even when they're indigenizing or whatever. They actually have to decolonize. And I want to acknowledge the point that you made in saying, like, anything decolonial that excludes Black people is not decolonial. And so therefore, you know, we need to have a larger discussion on terms of who's actually making decisions on validating knowledge, and to decolonize the way that we see knowledge, and that it shouldn't have to be validated through fucking post-secondary anymore. Like, that's just ridiculous. So anyways, I just want to think that.
I want to thank our panelists. A round of applause for every single one of them. This was a rich discussion. I want you to take that back to your tables, the roundtable discussion. Chantal and I are going to still ask you to fill out those forms. If you can fill them out, come up with some calls to action. We've heard actually quite a few. Hire more, right? This panel, what it looks like, this panel. If you can do that, that'd be great. And I think there is coffee and tea and lunch will be served. But please take a good 20 minutes, if you can, to write down those calls to action. Thank you so much.